that we, the people, are paying attention, that we will hold them accountable for following the law, upholding the Constitution, and make sure to let your lawmakers know when you support the work that they're doing so that they continue to do it. And let federal civil servants know that you support them and that you want them to keep doing their jobs and doing them well. I will continue to stand up to this chaos, to this lawlessness, and as part of that work, I will vote no on the Russell vote.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise tonight in opposition to the nomination of Russell Vought to be Director of the Office of Management and Budget, also known as OMB. My colleagues and I have been holding the Senate floor since yesterday to sound the alarm on this dangerous nomination. Russell Vought is the architect of Project 2025, the hateful, racist, sexist policy roadmap at the center of Trump's campaign. Mr. Vought has been working behind the scenes for years on policies to consolidate power, undermine the critical services that the federal government provides to the American people, and undermine Congress's power of the purse. When Vought was at the Office of Management and Budget during the last Trump administration, he demonstrated a complete lack of regard for our branch of government, the Congress. He was responsible for illegally withholding and delaying billions of dollars in congressionally appropriated funding, and now is planning to ratchet up this whole destructive power to a new level in 2025. And while Vought was withholding the funding that he and Trump don't like, he revealed a 2021 budget plan that showed us all the terrible things that he did like. That plan, authored by Russell Vought, proposed, listen to this, $500 billion in cuts to Medicare, $900 billion in cuts to Medicaid, $71 billion cuts to Social Security. And in those budgets, Vought was able to find $1.4 trillion to continue the tax that Trump gave, that big tax break to the millionaires and billionaires in our country, all paid for out of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And right now, Russell Vought is working behind the scenes and not even waiting to propose a budget. He is directing the agency to illegally cut billions of dollars in spending from programs that American families rely upon. Someone else's name may have been on the January 27th memo that came from OMB that froze all government spending, but make no mistake, it was authored by Russell Vought. Everything we are seeing right now, the illegal and unconstitutional actions being taken to dismantle federal agencies, freeze funding, steal the data of American citizens, is a push to further the Project 2025 playbook. Vought may be the one to have written the blueprint, but now he and everyone else, including the president himself, are taking orders from one man, Elon Musk. All of this chaos is because the richest man in the world spent more than $280 million on buying this election, and he wants to reap the benefits from his investment. For Donald Trump, DEI seems to only stand for defending Elon's interests. Now he and Vought are planning to make OMB stand for only Musk's business. Elon Musk and his unqualified, unelected government arsonists want to be able to carry out their attacks on your privacy, your rights, your friends and neighbors under the cover of darkness. Because with every new day, we are seeing Donald Trump's deep-pocketed puppeteer, Elon Musk, attempt to dismantle the government services that keep our communities clean, healthy, and safe. And they're acting with impunity. I just came from the Environmental Protection Agency, an agency created by Congress, authorized by Congress, signed into law by Richard Nixon, and one which the Environment and Public Works Committee, on which I sit, oversees. I was denied access to the EPA to talk to Musk Doge henchmen. No, you can't come in, Senator. You can't talk to these young people rumbling around, interviewing people who majored in physics and biology and chemistry who are protecting the clean air and clean water and clean lands in our country. No, you can't come in. Musk doesn't just believe he is above the law, he doesn't believe in the law at all. He believes that the United States Constitution does not apply to him. Elon Musk, not bound by the Constitution. And everyone knows that we have three branches of government created in the Constitution as separate articles defining the powers of each. Article 1 of the Constitution is the Congress. Article 2 of the Constitution is the presidency. Article 3 of the Constitution is the judiciary. But Elon Musk, he doesn't need to answer to any of those branches. Not to Congress, not to the courts, and certainly not to his newly bought presidency. It makes sense for Trump to make Elon Musk a buddy, the guy who declared bankruptcy 6 times really needs a rich guy around to bail him out. But it's almost as if Musk believes that he has his own special place in the Constitution, separate from the first 3 articles. In Musk's world, our Constitution contains an Article 3.5, right after Article 3 of the judiciary. And that new article that he believes exists and applies to him is a never-before-used provision in the Constitution with unlimited authority to remake our constitutional order with Musk as the unelected and unaccountable leader. Now, in Musk's world, Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution are toothless compared to the power reserved for him and him alone in Article 3.5. Right before Article 4. He just slipped it in now. Article 3.5. In Musk's world, Article 3.5 goes something like this. Article 3.5, the Muskocracy, his own separate provision in the Constitution. Section 1 of the Muskocracy, establishment of the Elon Musk branch. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches shall hereby recognize a new and supreme branch of government known as Elon Musk. This branch shall operate independently of the other 3 branches, unburdened by traditional constraints such as laws or ethics or the need for congressional approval. That's Article, Section 1. Section 2, powers and responsibilities for the Muskocracy. The Elon Musk branch shall wield absolute authority over, but not limited to, 1, federal agency reorganization. Abolish at will clause is in that section, whatever he decides. The Musk branch may, at any time, eliminate, restructure, or replace any federal agency by way of a single tweet. A lot of power that Section 1 has. Section 2, workforce optimization. All federal employees shall be subject to an immediate performance review determined by way of an AI-powered metric called the Productivity Index, trademarked. Any agency deemed inefficient shall be replaced by a new office staffed entirely by a mix of ex-premium subscribers, Tesla interns, and SpaceX engineers working 120-hour weeks. This is the Muskocracy. And it just continues. Data access. Part 3. The Musk branch shall have unrestricted access to all government personnel records, including security clearances, tax filings, and even embarrassing Slack messages. All goes to Elon Musk under Article 3.5 of the new United States Constitution, enacted on Inauguration Day in 2024. Then we have legislative override. All bills must be reviewed and memed upon by the Musk branch before passing. A simple "haha, no" tweet from the branch shall serve as an automatic veto. He didn't like it, just tweeted it out. Everyone will jump. Make sure that doesn't happen. This is the new Muskocracy within which we are now living. 3.5, Article 3.5 of the new Constitution of the United States of America. Judicial review. The Supreme Court shall be replaced with a single ex post where Elon asks, should this be legal? The most likely reply becomes binding precedent. It's the only way to govern. You can just see how it's all playing on X. That's the new Constitution of the United States, binding on the United States Senate, for sure. We can see that in the votes that are being cast out here by the majority. Then we move on to Section 3, administration and oversight. The Musk branch shall be staffed exclusively by engineers or AI-powered bots and a small staff of interns selected through an online gladiator-style coding competition. How else would you run America in 2025 but have those superior beings making all decisions for all of us? Then Section 4, checks and balances, all important. The checks and balances has always been the key. Going back to Madison and Jefferson, they thought through that, checks and balances, and so did Elon Musk in his Article 3.5, the Muskocracy provision that's now operative in our country in the Donald Trump presidency. So checks and balances says, although the existing 3 branches may express opinions, all official government actions require verification from the Musk branch, except those initiated by Musk himself, which are self-verifying because he's infallible. No one can question him. And any opposition to the Musk branch shall be met with immediate ridicule. Come on, you can't question Elon Musk. It's the new Constitution. That's how it is. Everyone should just understand. And then Section 5, succession and perpetuity. How does our country then operate into the future? Well, in the event that the physical Elon Musk ceases to exist, the Musk branch shall be transferred to an AI-trained on-off system for all of his tweets that are gathered together, and then Neuralink data and past Rogan podcast appearances, and that AI shall rule indefinitely unless overthrown by a more innovative billionaire. Isn't that really how we want our country to be running under this Muskocracy? Article 3.5? That's where we are right now. That's the country that we are living in. And does he have power? Oh, he has power. Because let's not kid ourselves. Right now, Elon wants us to live in the Muskocracy. The Trump administration is operating as if Article 3.5 is real, as if Elon Musk has supreme authority to override the will of Congress, seize government property, hire and fire at will, and otherwise bend government to his benefit regardless of the consequences. So let's not fool ourselves. We can see Article 3.5 in action right now. Musk is obsessed with shutting down USAID, slandering its public servants, spreading baseless conspiracy theories about the agency's work and mission. If we don't stop him now through legislation and lawsuits, he'll not only destroy our ability to address global crises that eventually impact us here at home, he'll go after the agencies that keep our food and water safe, our infrastructure repaired, and our communities secured. Gutting USAID will cause immediate harm to our national security, place our citizens at risk, and disrupt life-saving work. USAID helps protect children from starvation. It prevents the spread of infectious diseases. It is critical in our global fight against AIDS and HIV. If we don't hold the line on Elon Musk's abolition of USAID and the Trump administration's illegal actions, nothing will prevent him or Trump from doing the same thing to the CDC, to the Environmental Protection Agency, to the Small Business Administration. He's bragging that he put USAID in the wood chipper. He wants to do the same thing for every other agency. And that's why I'm voting no on every Trump nominee, while this illegal and unconstitutional power grab continues, while this chaos continues, and this corruption continues. The fights before us will not be easy, and there will be many. The American people are relying on us to protect their rights, their pocketbooks, and their families. And that starts with protecting them from nominees whose only goal is to dismantle the programs that help feed them, employ them, and keep them warm in the winter, educate them, and help them meet the ends that their families seek to achieve. We need to say no to the nomination of Russell Vought tonight, no to the illegal, unconstitutional Muskocracy, and no to the costlier, sicker, unhealthier future that Donald Trump is creating. I urge all members to vote no on Russell Vought as the administrator of the Office of Management and Budget.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, for the past 2 weeks, my office has received thousands of calls. Worried New Mexicans are taking time out of their busy day to share their stories and plead for help and assistance. Last Monday, as the country knows, when President Trump and Russell Vought illegally froze federal programs and grant money allocated by Congress, chaos erupted in New Mexico and across America. A single mother of 4 in Bernalillo wrote to me, "I will literally have to choose between feeding my children or paying for them to have private health insurance. I barely make it paycheck to paycheck as it is. This freeze would definitely put us over. Please help our state." A senior from Albuquerque told me, "My savings have been wiped out by home health care costs after one hospitalization. I'm unable to work and I'm living solely on Social Security income, most of which is eaten up by insurance premiums. I'm dependent on Medicare health treatments." A family doctor said that if the federal freeze on grants and programs were to be implemented, it would put a family clinic that serves 50,000 New Mexicans in immediate danger of closing. This would leave thousands of patients without access to primary health care. And this is to every rural health care center in America. Mr. President, I have story after story to share, but I know that several of my colleagues have so much to add as well tonight. I will just ask my Republican colleagues to please say a little prayer. Call your constituents in the next half hour and talk to them because they're going to be impacted by this. Vote no on Vought. This is terrible for the people that we represent. I ask unanimous consent to submit my remarks fully into the record, and I yield.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, now we know this, and this is a conversation I have quite often with individuals to talk about what is happening in my state when they ask me, what's going on in Washington? What is happening with the executive orders and this change in the administration? And one thing we talk about, and I think it is important because sometimes it gets lost in this conversation, is that When our system of government was created, about 250 years ago, it was created because the American people at the time decided they wanted a democracy. They didn't want a king. You know, the United States of America is born out of a revolution against a monarch, a king who sat on a throne and had really no checks on his power. And our founding fathers built this nation on a foundation of democratic principles, supporting the ideal that government is for the people. That's what the American people wanted. And as part of that creation, they established 3 co-equal branches of government. We all know the executive, the legislative, the judicial. And along with that, they created a system of checks and balances to ensure that no branch had too much control over the other. Now, as we all know, as we work here in Congress, that legislative branch is important. It's the first branch of government, co-equal to all the others, but it writes and passes laws, approves presidential nominations, but also importantly, the branch of government that we all work in is about passing a budget and controlling the purse. What does that mean? The money. We are the ones that decide how we spend this money, the budget for the federal government, where it's going to go, the appropriations for it. And that really is the power of Congress that our founding fathers gave to us. Now, the executive branch, we all know, founders gave the president the authority to veto, to implement, to enforce laws, along with the power to manage and direct government agencies. That is what the founding fathers envisioned, to ensure that our government puts the American people first and that no branch of government could become too powerful. Those are checks and balances that have been tested throughout our nation's history. Let me just give you an example. In 1974, President Richard Nixon refused to release funds approved by Congress for certain programs that he opposed. In response to his unconstitutional abuse of power, Congress passed bipartisan legislation called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974. This legislation reaffirms that once Congress passes bills that deliver funding to the American people, the president can't delay or cancel those funds. Unfortunately, today, we have a nominee for the Office of Management and
La IA de Google te ayuda a encontrar a tus mejores clientes optimizando tus campañas.
Power shouldn't exist. Now, you've heard this. My Democratic colleagues have been on the Senate floor since 2 p.m. yesterday to oppose Russ Vought. Why? Because Russ Vought is the co-author of President Trump's Project 2025 manifesto, and he's the chief architect of Trump's strategy to seize the power of the legislative branch. How are they doing that? Well, let's just talk about that. On January 27th, the OMB issued a memo to effectively suspend Congress's power of the purse by announcing a pause on all federal grants and loans. He shut down funding for practically every state and local program that receives money from the federal government. Now, like all of my colleagues, I have heard from Nevadans worried about accessing Medicaid or their VA benefits or funding for law enforcement or housing and energy payments that keep the lights on for low-income Nevadans. I've heard concerns about child care initiatives like Head Start that have no longer any funding, and programs to support seniors like Meals on Wheels are concerned. I have heard from tribes in Nevada. I just got out of my office meeting with one of our tribes who are still having trouble accessing housing funds and similar funds. Groups that support Nevada's domestic violence survivors don't know if they'll have the money to get critical resources to people in need. Nevada literacy programs that are helping children learn to read have been threatened with the loss of funding. Rural communities in Nevada receiving federal grants, ranging from community development grants to wastewater treatment. Several of those grants and that funding have been delayed or cut. Trump's funding freeze shut down support for safety and security for kids and families in the historic west side of Las Vegas. President Trump shut down $156 million in funding for solar energy in Nevada. We were going to install solar power on hundreds of buildings, helping bring down energy costs for 20,000 hardworking Nevada families. But President Trump illegally stopped these solar grants to Nevada. That has jeopardized thousands of good-paying jobs for laborers and construction crews in my state. And while the Trump administration claimed that Medicaid wasn't affected by the federal funding freeze, but the fact is the Medicaid payment system did go offline in all 50 states. Now, intentional or not, the OMB order was reckless, causing confusion and chaos for many across the country, including doctors and healthcare staff who didn't know if they were going to get paid for the work they do. Like my colleagues, my office is being flooded with these calls, including from Nevadans concerned about their future benefits from Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. These are real Americans who are being squeezed by this unconstitutional funding freeze, even though Donald Trump promised to make their lives better. Americans right now are being hung out to dry by Donald Trump and by Russ Vought, whose Project 2025 was clearly the inspiration for this dangerous funding freeze. Russ Vought is unfit to serve at the head of the agency that oversees our federal budget. During his confirmation hearing, he said the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 is unconstitutional. One man decides the laws in this state. Wow, that's a lot of power. He's basically saying he thinks the president should be able to withhold any funding that they don't like, even though that goes against the separation of powers our founding fathers wrote into the Constitution. Think about this. Under the last administration, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act that created incredible jobs, union jobs, and grew our economy in Nevada and across this country. Now President Trump and Russ Vought are saying the president doesn't have to deliver all that funding to communities in Nevada and across the country. Many of those communities have already broken ground on projects that they were promised funding for. Instead of focusing on the working families that Donald Trump said he was fighting for, he's clearly only interested in becoming as powerful as possible, no matter how many laws he breaks. Listen, you know something's wrong when firefighters who went to Los Angeles to help contain the devastating wildfires received emails from the Trump administration encouraging them to resign. It wasn't an email to say, thank you, you risked your lives, we couldn't do this without you. They actually sent a letter to these firefighters saying, well, it's time to resign. What kind of president thanks our firefighters by telling them to leave their jobs and leave our communities defenseless? He doesn't care about our safety and security. He only cares about his own. So now my question for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is, what's next? What will be the next congressional power we cede to Donald Trump and his billionaire friends? What will be the next crisis we have to clean up when we could be focusing on delivering for Americans? We're supposed to be representing the people of our states and fighting for them. And when I speak to Nevadans every single day, they expect me to get them the federal support they need. That means working across the aisle. I'll work with anyone to get things done on behalf of my state and across the country. But it also means standing up to anyone who would prefer to sow chaos and ignore the Constitution, violate our laws, usurp our power. Anyone who would rather do that and not tackle the real issues that Americans are dealing with right now. And let me say, I don't know anybody, one of my colleagues or anyone else, who doesn't support streamlining our federal government. I am here because I was so frustrated with the bureaucracy of the federal government and support streamlining it and think we should do that absolutely every day, work towards how we make it work for Americans. I support it. But what we need is a thoughtful business strategy to do just that. That is welcome. But burning the federal government to the ground, that's not a business strategy. That's just total destruction. And that's not what the American people deserve. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
This is the senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I join my colleagues. I thank the senator from Nevada for her great comments and articulating why we want to have a budget process here that recognizes the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, and to say that a budget process that tries to exclude us is not what our forefathers had in mind. That is one of the reasons I strongly oppose this nomination to be the director of the Office of Management and Budget for Russell Vought. The administration, like everyone before it, has had the opportunity to propose a budget, set overall policy principles, and propose spending and policies, and this administration does not have the power to wave a wand and erase legally authorized and appropriated funds. The Constitution is very clear here. Congress and the administration together agree on appropriations. They agree together when we pass laws and what we want to do to govern. And people should be able to rely on current laws until those laws are changed. That is how governing works. And we're here to represent the people who want to see the certainty and predictability of laws that we have passed. Regular review of programs and congressional oversight, as my colleague from Nevada just mentioned, those are valuable things. And we can continue to make reforms in thoughtful and transparent ways. We should not allow unaccountable political actors, though, to be unfettered, have access to our constituents' most sensitive data without safeguards to how that data is protected, their rights, and conflicts of interest, that how that data might even be used against them. Mr. President, I am for a very strong national privacy law to protect our consumers, and one person I don't want spying on us is the U.S. government. So I don't take lightly somebody getting access to accounts and information, storing it, moving it around, sharing it with other people. I don't care if they're 22 or 42. I'm not for the government doing this kind of thing without oversight. Taxpayers, I'm not even for the government spying on U.S. citizens, just to be clear. I'm not for that. But this is just data collection. Data collection, who's it going to, what are they doing with it, how much are they going to use it? So taxpayers, they rely on us for service. And they don't want to believe that somebody is looking around in these accounts. Even our own personnel management system got hacked by the Chinese. How do we know that there's safeguards for what these individuals are doing for our most personal information? But the havoc that has been caused by this nominee's strategy is just absurd. Today, I met with a group of farmers who were talking about how they grow and process export products. They told me because USAID operations were shut down, their products were stuck on a dock in Houston. They don't think they're ever going to get delivered, and they sure as heck don't think they're going to get paid. Is that what we want to do? Tell our farmers that they have a contract to grow a product, to have them delivered, and the shipment is on its way, and now you're going to leave it on a dock because you think you have a bright idea of a way to shortcut Congress? Over 1.8 million Washingtonians rely on Medicare. And they shouldn't have to be worried at any moment of the day that somehow that's not going to be paid for. But that's what happened when Washington State Healthcare Authority was frozen out of the Medicaid portal and the healthcare payments were not being made. Okay, my colleague just addressed that the portal eventually got turned on after the huge volume and outrage. Really, outrage by the public forced the administration to say, stop this silly attitude that you can stop payment yourself. They forced them to turn the portal back on and pay the Medicaid bills. But Washington State is also home to community health centers. They're nonprofit entities that serve the medically underserved population. Part of me is thinking this is really an attempt to steal money from our constituents just to pay for a tax bill. Literally, somebody thought they were going to come in here and make a very fast move and basically turn off payments to people who are really poor and in very challenging situations, and turn off their payments so they could take the money and put it into a tax break for the rich later on. That is absurd. It's absurd. It's not even legal. We were told by some of these health care centers that they were blocked from transferring federal funds to those needed in their hospitals. In other words, cutting off funding that would be helpful to saving lives. These health centers provide care to more than 1 million people in our state, over 360,000 of them. And there's children, agriculture workers, and veterans. And the fact that these medical systems work to help all of us provide primary care is exactly why we shouldn't turn off a system. I got a call from someone in Pierce County to tell me that her son, Tobias, who was 36 years old, he was recently diagnosed with multiple myeloma and is one of the youngest people who has gotten the diagnosis. They are absolutely terrified about the risk of losing cancer research dollars. She said, quote, she couldn't wrap her mind around it, quote, this insane and cruel road that we are all on now with this new administration, end quote. These are the stories from my constituents. They want to know what's going on in their lives. It's not a parlor game. It's not a think tank exercise. It is their lives. For one of the hospitals in my state, Island Healthcare in Anacortes, the funding freeze means they couldn't fill a contractual agreement to pay for surgical technology. They were under a contract to pay no later than 30 days after the receipt of the equipment, which is currently being shipped to them. So the first time this community was going to realize the benefit of some technology that was going to help them provide better outcomes through less invasive procedures, lower infection rate, and shorten the recovery time. But they don't know. The funds are frozen. The people of Anacortes could have to wait, and they may not even get the delivery of that care. Because OMB created uncertainty. They created it about the funding without thinking through the consequences. Multiple hospitals are worried about caring for their patients. Olympic Medical Center on the peninsula serves about 80,000 patients. They said to me, quote, even small changes in the federal grant spending will have detrimental impacts to their facility and to their community. A federal funding freeze just exacerbates our ability to deliver care that has been authorized, appropriated, and promised to the operation of our healthcare system. How could people be so heartless to try to turn that off? Andrea Downs, the executive director for Citizens Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Abuse, which is the only domestic violence and sexual assault agency for Whidbey Island, said they operate a center and a shelter. She said the funding freeze impacts about half of their funding. Portals not getting paid, no processing, no time. She quoted, not being able to access our grants for the remainder of this fiscal year would have a crippling impact on our organization, end quote. Our Walla Walla Tri-Cities-based nonprofit Blue Mountain Heart to Heart is also concerned about federal grants that they receive that support housing needs of people who live within the region. And they are also worried about the accountability of care that comes with the Medicaid funds. But probably nothing said it more clear to me than when I heard that Elon Musk and the Doge wanted to get their hands on the FAA. What should a man who's regulated by the FAA, his launch facilities are under the FAA's authority to keep us safe. They need to know and coordinate launch rocket times and to not have people just launch a rocket whenever they want. We already know the painful experience of these accidents on the Potomac, of not having a system overseen by air traffic controllers. But Mr. Musk was fined, and he didn't like the fine. He basically went after the FAA administrator, who decided to step down instead of serving with this administration. Now Mr. Musk wants his hands on the FAA to tell them what to do, probably in retribution for the fact that they said it wasn't safe to launch at that moment. This is a clear conflict of interest. Mr. President, we can do better than this. We're here to work together. We're here to work across the aisle. We're here to pass a budget. We're here to appropriate, and as an authorizer, to set those authorization and work with our appropriators. It is not for a nominee to set a game plan of how to take money out of the lives of individual families that are counting on that payment, or structural organizations that are charged with serving our communities on something as important as health or law enforcement. And it sure isn't turning the keys over to somebody who's already been fined by the agency to try to then undo the agency's oversight of his own personal business. There couldn't be a clearer answer here. Turn down this nomination. Let's get back to working together, working collaboratively. There are lots of ideas that we have to work on government efficiency, lots of ideas that could produce billions of dollars in savings, produce better care for our constituents, and move our country forward. And oh, by the way, let's not also continue to cut funding for all the authorized programs that these nominees basically said that they supported. That's why we voted for some of them, because they said they supported current funding, whether that's the Department of Transportation or other places. But now the mastermind of how to short circuit, pull the plug out, pull out the safety blanket, give it to the rich, is on a way for a vote here. Please vote no. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. I want to thank my colleague from Hawaii for last night, he and my colleagues coming to the floor and speaking all night. I think this is a conversation we've been trying to have to illuminate the damage that's happening to America from about 2 p.m. yesterday till now. I want to thank him. I think of him as one of the younger members of the United States Senate, but I think when you do an all-nighter, you realize that that maybe the years start to show a little early. So thank you so much for leading the charge on this all night yesterday.
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Oregon.
since yesterday afternoon, Democrats have held this floor to ring the alarm bells across the United States of America about the nomination of Russell Vought to lead the Office of Management and the Budget. Russ Vought may not be as famous as Donald Trump's other nominees, but as you've heard from so many Democrats, Radical Russ is Donald Trump's most dangerous nominee. He is the mastermind behind Project 2025. And following that script, he proudly breaks the law, he proudly violates the Constitution, and he proudly seeks to gut programs for ordinary American families to deliver trillions in tax giveaways to the richest Americans. Russell Vought's dead-of-night directives to freeze government payments have already sowed massive damage across our nation to programs for health care and housing and education and children. And then just today, I learned that the Bureau of Land Management is ordering small businesses to cease and desist all work for forest management. thinning the forests, doing prescribed burns to prevent massive forest fires from burning down our cities. That is literally Trump and Russ' vote playing with fire. The American people are angry about this sweeping authoritarian coup. They are calling our offices. 2,000 Oregonians called my office yesterday. Thousands of people showed up to my 9 town halls over the last 2 weekends. They're asking tough questions. How is it possible that Donald Trump could order dead-of-night directives that cut off funding for all the programs that help families get on their feet and thrive and get to the middle class, addressing child nutrition and affordable housing and health care? How is it possible that Trump can break the law to fire 17 inspector generals who protect the American people from executive branch corruption? How is it possible Trump can break the law to fire a member of the National Labor Relations Board who protects workers' rights? How is it possible Trump can dismantle USAID, which provides food and medicine and humanitarian aid around the world? How is it possible Russ Vote and President Trump can send Elon Musk groupies to access sensitive programs, accessing our data regarding Social Security payments and Medicare payments and veterans benefits and the tax records of every single American? This breach of privacy by Big Brother government is an extraordinary threat to the security of every single citizen. Now, Radical Russ has a 3-part plan for America. Got programs for working families, borrow trillions from the Treasury, give massive tax giveaways to the very richest Americans. This is the robber baron script. Take from ordinary families to give more to the best off. This is the opposite of what Trump campaigned on helping families. And now that he's in office, the campaign is giving way to, instead, Project 2025, which is about government of the billionaires, by the billionaires, for the billionaires. That's why the Democratic members of the Budget Committee asked to delay the vote on sending his nomination here to the floor, because we wanted to find out. We asked questions about what he was doing already over at the Office of Management and Budget when he hadn't been confirmed yet, holding meetings and sending out directives. He wouldn't answer those questions, so his file is incomplete. So we said, hold off for 2 weeks. But the Budget Committee chair refused to hold off and make sure that the file was complete. And then we said, we'll at least hold the meeting in public so we can share our thoughts back and forth, and the public can come in and witness it and see our arguments about why he should or shouldn't be voted to send to the floor. And instead, the meeting was held in private. So that was why we were so concerned then, and as you've heard from 41 Democrats over the last 30 hours, why we're so concerned now with the philosophy and actions of Radical Russ Vote. We are working day and night, fighting for working families, fighting for the Constitution, and fighting to stop this sweeping authoritarian takeover. To my friends across the aisle, Radical Russ wants to steal the power of the purse given to Congress in this Constitution, our Constitution, and give it to Donald Trump to decide what is and isn't funded. Radical Russ wants to steal the power to write laws given to Congress in the Constitution and give it to Donald Trump to rule by executive order and presidential fiat. And Radical Russ has attacked the Constitution before. Remember, he is the force that said, let's stop payments to Ukraine, that got President Trump into trouble in his first administration. We here have taken an oath to defend the Constitution. For working Americans, for all Americans, join us in voting no, because Radical Russ is dangerously unfit for public office.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
Mr. President, Democrats have spent virtually every minute of the last 30 hours sounding the alarm about the dangers of Russell Vote. We feel it a mission to let America know that Russell Vote is a threat to Social Security, to Medicare, to child care, to veterans benefits, and so much more. He's the wrong man. He seems to care little about the needs of American families. At the wrong place, at powerful OMB, where his decisions will be felt in every corner of the country, with the wrong agenda, the horrible Project 2025. There are 3 strikes against Russell Vote, and he should be out. He's the wrong man, for the wrong place, with the wrong agenda. Mr. Vote's policies will hurt children and seniors, hurt veterans, hurt homeowners, and so many of our other friends and neighbors. The only people who should celebrate Russell Vote are Donald Trump's billionaire friends when they get another tax break. I caution my Republican colleagues, voting to place the chief architect of Project 2025 in charge of White House policy will come back to haunt them. If the chaos of the last 2 weeks is any indication of what's to come, Russell Vote will be a massive liability for Donald Trump, for Republicans, and worst of all, for the country. Tonight, I will vote no, fervently, strongly, with complete conviction, and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, we're getting up now close to the time to vote on the vote nomination. And it's been a 30-hour discussion, conversation, and some of which I think is perhaps instructive. I mean, I'd make an argument, honestly, that through multiple administrations that Congress has bequeathed and given up way too much power to the executive branch. And but I think through the all-night vigil and a lot of the speeches that were made over here, there was a lot of high rhetoric, I would argue, about attacks on democracy, attacks on the Constitution. And I think it's important just when you make those arguments that there be at least some amount of self-reflection. Because over the last 4 years, there have been a lot of times when the executive branch went around the Congress or tried to rewrite the laws that Congress had passed in ways that increased spending. And I can use a good example under the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Commerce Committee, which is where I spent a lot of my time over the past few years. There was a program called the BEAD program, which was designed to extend broadband access to people in rural areas of the country, unserved areas of the country. And it passed almost, well, about 3 years ago. I didn't vote for it at the time, but that provision in the bill was designed to deliver broadband services to unserved areas, rural areas of the country. And we are now 3 years into that program, and there hasn't been a single dollar spent or a single household connected through that program. And it was a $42 billion funding program. $42 billion. Not a single dollar spent. Why? Because the administration decided to add conditions to it. Conditions that made it unusable to a lot of the telecoms, at least certainly the telecoms in my area, and I think I represent probably as rural of an area as you'll ever find. What were some of those conditions? Well, they said you had to use union labor, something in South Dakota we're a right-to-work state, so we don't have a lot of that. You had to meet climate conditions for your subcontractors, your suppliers, everything else. You had to comply with certain climate requirements. And then there was an issue about rate regulation. Now, rate regulation, interestingly enough, was specifically banned by the statute. The statute said no rate regulation. So what the administration did is they added to the law in all these ways in a way that made it virtually impossible for anybody to use. So here we are, 3 years later, 3 years after that law passed this Congress, and not a single dollar has been spent, and not a single household has been connected. Why? Because the executive branch decided they wanted to do some things with this law that Congress never intended. I didn't hear the complaints about that or all-night vigils. Another thing I'll point out is the student loan program. Now, as we all know, the student loan program, of course, authorized, again, funded by Congress, and that's a subject of ongoing litigation. I think we all know that. But it's hundreds of billions of dollars, actually, increase in spending. Not cutting spending, but increasing spending. And again, totally outside the parameters of what Congress intended for the program. The law is pretty clear, we believe. And I think when you sign agreements, there are a lot of financial agreements that students enter into on the student loan program. And essentially what has been said by the previous administration, the executive branch, the attack on democracy, was that that's not going to apply. And we're just going to forgive them all. We'll wipe out all the agreements. We'll go around the law, circumvent the law. And folks on this side of the aisle applauded when that happened. Again, action taken by the executive branch outside the parameters of what Congress intended when that law was passed. I'll use one other example, and that's the Thrifty Food Program. I serve on the Senate Agriculture Committee, as does Senator Grassley and a lot of other of our colleagues. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was a provision in there that allows the Department of Agriculture to use this program for sort of inflationary increases. The Thrifty Food Plan is based on current food prices, food composition data, consumption patterns, and dietary guidance. But, interestingly enough, what the Department of Agriculture decided to do was go around 45 years of precedent and do something that had never been done before and dramatically increase the program by $250 billion. $250 billion. It wasn't an inflationary increase that was based on the cost of this program over time. It was something that had never been done before. And the Government Accountability Office busted the administration for doing it. But they used very cynically the 2018 Farm Bill as the basis for USDA's action, but Congress never agreed to permit $250 billion increase in spending. So again, I mean, these are decisions made by the previous executive branch, which happened to be the executive branch of a different party, and everybody had a sort of different reaction at that time. So I'm certainly somebody who is not deaf to what I'm hearing out there about some of the decisions that are being made by this new administration and their willingness to look at and evaluate programs, perhaps reprioritize them based upon their priorities. I think that's something a lot of administrations do. And I think there's probably a lot of the program spending decisions that you all are concerned about, I'd probably agree with. But I just don't think that coming down here and launching what are, quote, attacks on democracy or, trying to seize power from the Congress really matches with the facts of what happened in the last 4 years. And I'll just use those three examples, but I think there are three pretty glaring examples of what happened in the last 4 years. And then the final thing I'll say, because I think everybody here knows we've had this conversation a number of times, but it wasn't that long ago that there was a letter, 2017, from a lot of members of United States senators on both sides. It was Democrats and Republicans, and many on the Democrat side of the aisle who are still here today, that basically said, and I will quote it for you, "We're mindful of the unique role the Senate plays in the legislative process, and we're steadfastly committed to ensuring that this great American institution continues to serve as the world's greatest deliberative body. Therefore, we're asking you to join us in opposing any effort to curtail the existing rights and prerogatives of senators to engage in full, robust, and extended debate as we consider legislation before this body in the future." The legislative filibuster, part of the Senate's heritage as an institution, the way the founders intended for it to operate. And in 2017, there were 32 Democrat senators who signed that letter. A number of them who are here today, and I think you probably know who you are. Well, it didn't take very long when you had a little change in the power where you had the Democrats, everyone who was here at the time, some of you weren't, some of you were new, voted to get rid of the filibuster. You voted to change the rules. You know where it was going, and some of you have been very public about it. And you've been very public about it, what you would do if that happened. And what the issue at that time was whether or not to federalize elections, which again has constitutional issues, given the prerogatives of state legislatures to set the conditions under which elections are held. So if you've got a history of, you're arguing here, there's all these attacks on democracy, all I'm pointing out is that that was a very different standard in the last 4 years in the last administration, and particularly as it pertains to the legislative filibuster. That is an issue. I don't think anybody here could argue. It's more connected to this institution than probably anything else. It gives voice to the minority. It requires collaboration and bipartisanship to do anything consequential. And at the time, everybody thought it was a good idea to preserve it. A couple years changed, the political winds in Washington changed, and all of a sudden it was time to get rid of it. So we're going to vote on this nomination, but I think it's important to point out in the debate how many times an argument was made here on the floor by members on this side about attacks on democracy and going around or circumventing the authority and the power of the Article I branch of the government, the Congress, the Senate of the United States, by an executive branch. And yet here are three pretty, I would say, glaring examples of something done by the previous administration. Former Mayor Marion Barry once described his political philosophy as situationist. And I think when it comes to politics, we all have our views informed and changed perhaps over time. But these are some pretty striking, I think, and glaring examples of the inconsistency that is being applied to the current administration when, in fact, the previous administration of a different political party, came to some very aggressive conclusions with respect to how they wanted to modify and change and alter laws passed by this institution, the United States Senate. So, Madam President, I think it's time to vote, and let's proceed with the vote.
All time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
I vote
Pursuant to Rule 7, no debate is permitted. Debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend. The clerk will continue to call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend. The clerk will continue to call the roll.
Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend. The clerk will continue to call the roll.
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend. The clerk will continue to call the roll.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Mr.
The
Cotton.
senator will suspend.
Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Ms.
The
Ernst.
senator will suspend.
Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Mr. Hickenlooper.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Ms. Hirono.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane.
I vote no on a man who wants to...
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Kelly.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. King.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey,
Clean air and clean water, I vote no.
Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mrs. Moody,
Aye.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray.
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Ossoff,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Padilla,
No debate is permitted during a vote.
Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Reed,
No debate is permitted during a vote.
Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Schiff,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer,
Mr. Schumer, you should know, pursuant to Rule...
Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote.
Ms. Smith,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Warner,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Warnock,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Ms. Warren,
Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse,
No debate is permitted during a vote. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden,
No debate is permitted during a vote, sir. The senator will suspend.
Mr. Young,
The senator is not recorded. Pursuant to Rule 12, no debate is permitted during a vote. Ma'am, the senator will suspend. I couldn't hear him. The senator is not recorded. Thank you. Sir.
On behalf of the taxpayers who've been insulted for too long, I vote aye.
Remember, sir, that
Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Budd, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Hall, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Thune, Tuberville. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Betterman, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Brett, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye.
The yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The nomination is confirmed.
Mr.
Majority
President,
Leader.
Madam President, I move to reconsider the vote, and I move to table the motion to reconsider.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that all votes going forward be 10-minute votes.
Without objection. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. I got you. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. I got him. Mr. Heinrich. Thank you. No, I didn't. Mr. Hickenlooper.
Poor execution. Not long enough.
I got you.
Sorry.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice. I got you. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim, Mr. King. Yeah, we do. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee.
Thanks, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick. Did you? Yeah, it's okay. That's what I thought. Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. I got you. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski. I got you. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer. God. No? Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. I didn't. Thank you. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slatkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville. I got you. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Heidsmith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt-Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kelly, Kim, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. King, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Kramer, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. Majority Leader.
Madam President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be so. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks.
Good job.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell.
No, don't. No. It is. I used to work for Congressional Records a million years ago. And I would hang out over here. I was Tom. So, for some reason, it's less busy than well, because they're taking
Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven,
Good job. Thank you for saying
Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff.
Bennett first to vote in chair.
Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Fisher, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Hall, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Sheehy, Thune, Tuberville, Wicker. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Duckworth, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Schiff, Schumer, Slotkin, Smith, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Ms. Hirono, no.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to.
Madam President, I move to proceed to executive
Majority
session to
Leader.
consider calendar number 18.
Question is on the motion. There a sufficient second? There appears to be. We'll call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Thank you. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, see. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, thank you, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moody, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, I did get you, thank you. Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, that's who it was. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. I got you. Mrs. Shaheen. Thank you. Mr. Grassley. Thank you. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting, you did, in the affirmative. Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Moran? Aye. Thank you. I had to. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Mr. Graham, aye. You did, thank you. She already voted, right? Senators voting in the negative. Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Van Hollen, Warnock, and Welch. Somebody's in there that I... White House, no. Thank you. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Lankford, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Smith, no.
Clerk will record the nomination.
Nomination, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii to be Director.
The clerk will record the motion.
Vote your motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii to be Director of National Intelligence, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Madam President, I ask consent that the reading of the names be waived.
Is there objection?
I move to proceed.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin.
Yeah, right, Rick.
Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden,
No way. Yeah, there's just three, Marianne.
That's fine, I'll get more. Thank you.
Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Curtis, Gaines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Schumer, Slotkin, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Welch. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to.
President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 17.
Questions on the motion?
For the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?
No, there's not.
Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso.
Hey, Chris,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just paying attention.
don't you guys screw me up. You don't want that. Don't do that. Because then I'm going to say no. And then we'll do it the hard way.
Shots. McCormick, thank you. Daines.
Aye.
Fisher. Rounds. Mr. Bennett. Thanks. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt. I did, thank you. Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim. I do, I got you. Yeah, I got you, thank you. I got you both, thank you. Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar. Thank you. Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski. Yeah. Gotcha. Thank you. Yes, now I do. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Thank you. Yes. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Murphy, senators voting in the negative. Also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Lujan, Markey, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Bennett, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 47, and the motion is agreed to. Clerk will record the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. of California to be secretary.
But this one's just going to ledge, so.
Okay.
Guess what?
Are we in?
Isn't it cloture motion?
Majority Leader?
Madam President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will record.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
Madam President, I ask consent the reading of the names be waived,
Is there objection? No objection.
and I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion.
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo,
She's got it in her hand. Doesn't look like it's been copied.
Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, I guess that. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Thune, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. King, no.
Okay.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 45. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, how long was
Majority
the last
Leader.
vote? How long was the last vote?
11 minutes.
Okay. For the balance of the votes, Mr. President, we're going to ask members to stay in their seats, senators to stay in their seats, and we're going to move through this just as quickly as we possibly can. So we'll have the clerk call the roll, and if people in their seats, we ought to be able to do these in 5 to 7 minutes. So I move to proceed to consider calendar number 19.
The question is on the motion.
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Mr. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Thank you. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. Thank you. Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick. Oh, you're back there. Thank you. Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen. Thank you. Mr. Sheehy. I didn't forget you. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Murphy. Come here. Mr. Van Hollen. You got him. Senators voting in the negative. Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Hassan, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. This vote, the yeas are 52.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. Report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick of New York to be Secretary.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Howard Lutnick of New York to be Secretary of Commerce, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names to be waived.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I'm going to move here to go to legislative session in just a minute, but I'm going to point out that these next noms that are coming up are bipartisan noms. We're coming up on the Department of Agriculture Secretary, whose nomination was reported out of the Senate Agriculture Committee unanimously. Not a single dissenting vote. So it seems like we might be able to expedite this a little bit. I don't know how long that last vote took, but we're going to keep grinding away here, and hopefully we can do better on this next one. So I would ask that we move that we proceed to legislative session.
Yeas and nays.
Questions on the motion? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane,
Been up for a while.
Mr. Kelly,
No, I'm good. Shockingly.
Mr. Kennedy,
But I don't like the idea of dropping.
Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick,
But no homework.
Mr. Merkley,
Right? No school. Let's keep it then. I mean,
Mrs. Moody,
10 for school?
Mr. Moran,
Homework is 10, 11.
Mr. Moreno,
Homework's 9. So you're good.
Mr. Mullen,
Oh, well.
Ms.
Like the
Murkowski,
order then.
Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray,
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren,
Do you need more water, sir?
Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse,
Okay.
Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Kelly, no.
Yeas are 51, nays are 46. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 16.
Questions on the motion? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett. Thank you. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Thank you. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. You said no. Okay. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Moran? Aye. Senators voting in the negative. Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Markey? No.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins of Texas to be secretary.
Mr. President, again,
order.
I'm going to send a cloture motion to the desk on a nominee that came out of the Ag Committee 23-0. I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Brooke Rollins of Texas to be Secretary of Agriculture, signed by 17 senators as follows.
May the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I move that we proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Sorono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker,
T to the L.
Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Hall, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Schatz? No.
The ayes are 53, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 20.
Questions on the motion?
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Gotcha, guys. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Baldwin. Okay, wait. Baldwin. Ricketts. You're a no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Cruz. Johnson. Capito. I got you.
You say you got me.
I did. Thank you. I did get you. Thank you. Corny. Thank you. I do. Thank you. Mr. Bennett. Thank you. Gotcha. Awesome. Smith. Thank you, Bill. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Ernst, Cassidy, Ernst, Sanders. Sanders, thank you. Thank you. I got you. Thank you. Curtis. Lee. Gotcha. Lee. Houston. Daines. Brian.
You guys have a good weekend. Stay out of trouble.
Thank you. Mr. Wyden. Thank you. Randall Warner. Gotcha. Gotcha. Yep. Slotkin. Okay, Warnock.
White House no, if you don't mind.
I will. Thank you very much. Thank you. Got you. I got you too. I do. Thank you. Thank you.
That's not fair. That was not good.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Have a good weekend. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, I did. Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slatkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Bozeman, aye.
The ayes are 53, nays are 45. The ayes are 53, the nays are 45. The motion is approved. The clerk will report the nomination.
Small Business Administration, Kelly Loeffler of Georgia to be administrator.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Kelly Loeffler of Georgia to be administrator of the Small Business Administration, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent the reading of the names to be waived.
Without objection. Okay. Senator from Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session and be in a period of morning business for debate only, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointment at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 66, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
SRES 66, supporting the goals and ideals of Career and Technical Education Month.
Is there objection to proceeding with the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I understand that there is a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 29, an act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday, February 10, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 18, Tulsi Gabbard. Finally, that the Senate vote at 5:30 p.m. on the motion to invoke cloture on the Gabbard nomination.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday.